Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia education program where we explore what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is Carol Berkin, one of America's foremost historians in women's history, the American Revolution, the Constitution, and the politics of our early republic. Well, Carol is Presidential Professor of History Emerita of Baruch College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. She's also a senior advisor to our Real American Revolution. Her books include Jonathan Sewell, Odyssey of an American Loyalist, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize.
Didn't
Also,
win.
also co-editor of Women of America, a history, the first published collection of original essays in American women's history. Also, First Generations, Women in Colonial America, and one of my particular favorites, A Brilliant Solution, Inventing the American Constitution, which is awarded the Colonial Dames of America Book Prize. Another favorite of mine is Revolutionary Mothers, Women in the Struggle for American Independence. Now, today I'll be talking to Carol about her book, The Bill of Rights, The Fight to Secure America's Liberties, which was published in 2015. So, Carol, welcome to the Real American Revolution. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, Carol, I can't think of a better time to discuss our Bill of Rights in a time when Americans know so little about our Constitution, perhaps our Bill of Rights as well, and how our government's even supposed to function. So let's begin.
Okay.
Now, many of us were taught in school at the very outset, whenever the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or the Declaration come up in discussion, that James Madison was the father of the Constitution, and of course, George Mason was the father of our Bill of Rights. Who do you view as being correct?
Well, both of those are exaggerations. It is true that James Madison proposed the general agenda for the convention, but so many things changed and so many different decisions were made over the course of the 4 months that really at the very end you'd have to say that the entire convention was the father of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Nothing that Madison proposed was unusual or new. The Constitution itself really was modeled on British history, all of the things that my students always think were original in the Constitution. They always, separation of powers, the Constitution invented that. Tripartite government. None of that is true. The British had it, the state governments had it, they already had written constitutions. And so what Madison did really was put on the agenda the idea that they needed to replace the Articles of Confederation and create what 18th century people called nationalists called an energetic government. That is a government with powers. Mm-hmm. So if people want to say he was the father of the Constitution, it's sort of a simplification. And it diminishes, the only reason I oppose it is it diminishes all the work that the men at the convention did. They really hammered out all of these things. Mm-hmm. As for George Mason being the father of our Bill of Rights, again, the same thing. If anything, I would say Madison was really wholly responsible for the Bill of Rights, because when he proposed it in the first Federal Congress, everybody said, go away, Jimmy, don't bother us. We don't need that. All the states have bills of rights. You know, there's nothing we need to do in the federal government. So let's get down to more serious business. And Madison persisted. I mean, Madison drove them crazy, basically, until finally it was decided that they may as well do it and get it over with. And so I would really see him as very much the driving force of the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Well, those individuals who do recognize Madison's work on the Bill of Rights think that his motive for really drafting the Bill of Rights was a personal commitment to, individual liberties and freedoms and rights. Were you surprised or perhaps somewhat disillusioned, maybe, in your research to uncover his frankly political motivations and goals?
No, I expect political leaders to be political. And one of the things that I admire about Madison, because Madison's a difficult person, I think, to like. He was hypochondriac. He had anxiety attacks. He was a Budinsky in the sense of the business at hand that people wanted to pursue. But he was a very good strategist. And he understood that even though the Constitution was ratified, at least half the voting population in America still did not trust the Constitution, did not want the Constitution. And one of the reasons that the anti-federalists, which is what the opponents of the Constitution were called, argued against it was that it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Look, that government is going to be tyrannical because it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. In truth, they knew this was a popular scare tactic because what they really didn't want was for a government to have more power than the state governments. They really liked that the states had all the power. And so Madison was smart enough to realize if you were going to win over the population, it would be wise to say, okay, look, we have a Bill of Rights. Secondly, he was wise enough to know that if Federalists, which is what he was at the time, proposed the Bill of Rights, they could be careful what was included in it. And they did not include anything that would eviscerate the power of the federal government. That is, they were very careful to stick to general rights that people could say, yeah, that was a very good idea. Yeah, that was a good, and not to say things like, well, the government can't tax, which is what the anti-federalists wanted. So he was very smart about what he was doing. And I admire him for this. But he was a complex person. And as he put forward the proposals he did, he thought, if we could establish certain things as national givens, we would go far toward protecting the republic. And what he really wanted to do in the long run was, he wouldn't have had this phraseology, but he wanted to instill in the American public the idea that certain rights are a definition of what being an American was. And it took many decades, it took almost a century, but in fact, that is what happened. People look to the National Bill of Rights and they go, yeah, that at least they did until recently. Yeah, that is what we are. That defines us. That's our identity. That's our value system. And when we do something that goes against it, a bell goes off in our head that says, well, wait a minute, that's not American. And so I think that it's possible for Madison to be both a clever politician and strategist and someone who had a vision for the ideals of America. I don't see it's not an either or. It's a both, thank goodness.
You're right. Well, I know because of the times and the response to British injustices and some of those things, to what extent do you think the Bill of Rights evolved as a response to the British actions that were taken, perhaps the injustices that we identified during America's colonial past, rather than maybe a visionary document that a lot of us view today? How do you?
Absolutely. I don't know why we keep trying to turn 18th century political figures into seers, into visionaries, into people. The only person I would grant that vision, that label to, is Alexander Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Hamilton, even before we won the war, had a plan for how to make America an economic competitor with
Right.
Britain. The Constitutional Convention was trying to solve an immediate crisis. They really weren't, oh, what will it be like 2 generations from now? And Madison wasn't doing that either. He looked as we would look if we were writing something. What in the past, the immediate past, do we want to protect against?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what most of the Bill of Rights is. It's a response to search and seizure. You know, you can't invade John Hancock's warehouse unless you have a writ that says you can, right? Something that is very much in our news today, right?
Right.
You have to have a judge say, yes, you have a right to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you look at most of the articles, you'll see that they have, and I try to describe that in my book in detail,
Right.
most of them have as antecedents something that the British government did during the colonial period, or something that has come up in states like Virginia that need to be addressed. Madison's achievement does not have to rest on his being able to see that 200 years later it would be relevant.
Right. That's very, very pragmatic. I mean, they're dealing with the issues of the day.
Exactly.
You know, they're not looking into a crystal ball saying, we want to write this so that 250 years from now, certain things will be applicable. You know?
Especially since most of them, including Benjamin Franklin, remember Franklin says, if this Constitution survives for 10 years, we will have done our duty.
Right.
So, you know, they're not, and you see it very clearly in the way they dealt with slavery. They believed, first of all, they believed that if they raised the issue of ending slavery, that the entire Southern delegations would leave the convention. They wouldn't get anything done. But also, they sincerely, I think, believed that slavery was going to die a natural death. Tobacco production, many of the people, including Washington, had moved to wheat production as their primary activity because the market had fallen out for tobacco. And wheat, as we all know, doesn't require a big labor force. You plant the wheat, you sit around and wait till it grows, and then you harvest it. So they thought slavery would, in essence, take care of itself. Why? Because they could not envision the cotton gin. They couldn't go, oh, in the 19th century, they're going to invent the cotton gin and then slavery will spread like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have that vision. They weren't looking to the 19th century when they wrote the when Madison proposed, and then everybody worked on in Congress worked on the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm. That really leads me to my next question. In what ways did the debate, specifically over the Bill of Rights, represent the central conflict in American politics at the time, which was nationalism versus states' rights?
It represented it, but the states' rights, with the exception of one decision in the Senate, it was a losing battle for them because Federalists had taken the Congress. Mm-hmm. They had really an overwhelming majority. And so the poor fellows who represented the anti-Federalist position kept proposing things and they were voted down. They kept proposing, first they kept proposing we don't need the Bill of Rights. then they said the Bill of Rights should include everything that every state convention had proposed as an amendment to the Constitution, and this was voted down. So really, the Bill of Rights was a kind of Federalist juggernaut until it got to the Senate. And senators, if everyone recalls their civics lessons, senators were chosen by state legislatures.
Right.
They were not elected. And so they owed their power and their position to the state legislatures. And when they saw that Madison had included and the House had approved the statement that the federal government could intervene if a state abused or went against the Bill of Rights, that would give the federal government enormous power.
Mm-hmm.
And the senator said, we're not going to put our approval on something that will mean we will never be chosen for this House again. And they wiped that out. And Madison knew. People had talked about the Bill of Rights as being a parchment document that is not worth what the paper it was written on. Mm-hmm. If it didn't have enforcement authority. Mm-hmm. And the Senate threw the enforcement authority out. And the federal government does not get it back till the 14th Amendment. Mm-hmm. That is, it doesn't get it back till after the Civil War. And even then, our judicial system does not begin to deploy the idea of the precedent of the Bill of Rights until the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So on the biggest issue of all, really, the Federalists lose. And Madison was well aware, he was well aware that this was an enormous defeat. Mm-hmm. But certainly the issue underlying all of this was nationalists, that is, the people who wanted the federal government to have strong power and authority, superior to the states wherever possible, and the states' rights group that said real sovereignty has to lie with the state governments. Mm-hmm. And within a couple of years, I mean, here's the irony, within a couple of years, Madison has flipped. He's become a states' rights advocate. He is second in command to Jefferson, who is a states' rights advocate. And the Federalists, by the beginning of the 19th century, are emasculated, lose their power.
Absolutely.
So things turn on a dime in this early period.
Sure. Well, a lot of people talk about the Constitution. I mean, you had just mentioned the parchment barrier and the importance of that. But a lot of people talk about, the word, what's expressly written in the Constitution and that type of thing. So one little word is so important in our constitutional history. Could you elaborate on the word expressly a little bit?
Yes. Here, this sums up also the whole national debate over where ultimate sovereignty lies. The Anti-Federalists wanted in Congress, they weren't yet Jeffersonian Republicans because the parties hadn't formed. It was Hamilton's economic plans that caused the rise of the parties. They wanted the 10th Amendment to say the federal government doesn't have any powers that are not expressly mentioned in the Constitution. That meant that you couldn't have a philosophy that said that there were unspoken rights, broad construction versus strict construction.
Right.
This would mean that you could only do something if it was expressly granted to the federal government in the Constitution. And for the Federalists, this was the end of the federal would be the end of the federal government, and they managed to block the inclusion of that word expressly. People should realize that that tiny word, that one word, would have changed the whole course of American history.
Mm-hmm.
And almost no one ever teaches that. No one ever pays attention to that. And it really is the two things that are most critical in the Bill of Rights are that word and the fact that the Senate took away the power of the Bill of Rights, the power of the federal government to intervene when a state abridged or went against the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
Those are two things that I would be willing to bet, much to my sadness, are not talked about in classrooms, even college classrooms,
Mm-hmm.
even graduate classrooms. And that is one of the reasons why I spent my time, instead of playing, writing the Bill of Rights book.
Mm-hmm.
Because I wanted people to realize how important those two things were.
It really is important, because a lot of people who are opposed to expanding rights today to whatever groups or individuals are always saying, well, it's not in the Constitution.
Right.
You know, they're
Right.
trying to say that expressly is in the Constitution, and it prohibits the expansion of rights.
Exactly. And people who are I call them fundamentalists about
Right,
the Constitution, or originalists about the Constitution,
Right.
fall back on, remember Jefferson and Hamilton, when the bank was proposed, the Bank of the United States was proposed. Washington, who was himself a nationalist, really, when they proposed the Bank of the United States, Jefferson opposed it. And Washington said, okay, Hamilton, you and you, Jefferson, write your opinions, make your case. And Jefferson's case was, it's not in the Constitution, there's no mention of a Bank of the United States, ergo you cannot do it. And Hamilton, of course, said, there have to be implied powers.
Right.
The right to collect revenue implies the right to have some place to put it. And Washington supported that implied powers argument. But we hear repeatedly today, it's not in the Constitution. It's not there. And expressly would have given them quite a leg to stand on.
Sure, absolutely. Well, you mentioned the transition that Madison made. When he drafted the Bill of Rights, he was an ardent nationalist. And then, of course, his work with the Virginia resolutions, he was a champion of states' rights. So let's talk a little bit about Madison. How do you explain his dramatic shift in politics? Was it from a pragmatic standpoint, or what was it?
No, I think he woke up and remembered he was a Virginian. I think
Right.
Remember, Hamilton's economic policy in his three reports on public credit, the report on manufacturing,
Right.
which if that had gone through, if they had approved that, would have industrialized America many decades sooner.
Right.
His report on the bank, they set the trajectory of American economic history to be, in the 19th century, liberal capitalism. Today, we're in a corporate financial capitalism that is not what Hamilton envisioned. It really upsets me when people say Hamilton is to blame for corporate greed. Hamilton did not support that. He wanted the government to open up the economy for Americans at a time that was vastly different from today. And what Madison saw was that meant that agriculture would no longer be the dominant economic basis of American society, that the economic basis of American society would be commerce, industry, and ultimately industrialization.
Yeah.
And he looked at Virginia and he said, Virginia, which is the dominant state at the moment, the richest, the most populous state, will become a handmaiden to industry. Right. And Jefferson supported his transformation, and he became a states' rights advocate.
Sure.
It is one of the most dramatic shifts in ideology. And yet, if you think about it, I mean, Madison was a plantation owner. It shouldn't be so surprising, but it is sort of shocking.
Sure.
And he came to be the great opponent in Congress of Alexander Hamilton.
Interesting. Well, do you think that that specifically the adoption of the Bill of Rights, given the fact of his what would normally be a states' rights position, for him to really turn things around and focus on the Bill of Rights, do you think that that really defines him as a master politician?
Oh, absolutely. And I think afterwards, when he becomes a states' rights advocate, he remained a master politician.
Right.
I mean, Madison, this is just my view. Jefferson would have made a great, I always say this, academic professor. You know, great thoughts, big ideas, mulling things over. If you've ever been in a faculty meeting in most universities, it's like the thinker. Everybody mulls things over, everybody has an, and usually at the end of the faculty meeting, they say, oh, this is such a complex thing. We have to raise it at the next meeting too.
Table it to the next time.
Yes. A Hamiltonian would say, for God's sake, let's have a plan. Let's do something.
Right.
Let's see what we can do. So Madison was critical to the development of the Jeffersonian power, I think, because he was the one who said, okay, what's our policy? What are we going to do? Jefferson was always sort of off on a level of thought that was a little bit more, he could be wily. I mean, he could be. There's no question. Jefferson, who kept saying, oh, I'm not organizing a political party. I'm not, was of course busy organizing a political party.
Right.
But I think the two of them together are what made the Jeffersonian party so successful. And then Adams, who was a terrible administrator and a terrible president, helped seal the deal. So I would say that Madison remains really a master politician.
Absolutely. Well, would you call the Bill of Rights, from looking at it from a practical standpoint, a victory for the nationalists or maybe the anti-federalists?
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both.
Yeah. I think history, that is what happened later on, gave the Federalists the victory in the sense that we do think of the Bill of Rights as defining us as Americans. At least we have up until recently. We do think of it that way. People do think, gee, that goes against what we stand for. And in that sense, it is a success because it defines the federal government, then defines the American national character. On the other hand, the Bill of Rights does not resolve that issue that caused Hamilton to stand up in the convention and say, you can't divide sovereignty between the states and the national government. somebody has to have ultimate power. If we don't do that, it's going to be hell to pay. And of course, he was right. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, nullification controversy, the Civil War, right up until today, and during the Civil Rights Movement, when the governor stood in front of the schoolhouse in Arkansas and said, I don't care what the Supreme Court says, we're not going to integrate our schools, right up until today, when some states don't accept federal Supreme Court rulings, one set of rulings, and other states don't support the other. Sure. And here we have today a discussion of another civil war. So absolutely. I think the history moves this country sometimes in the direction of the anti-federalists, that is the states' rights group, and sometimes in the direction of the federal government.
Sure.
Events do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've just kind of answered my next question, which I was going to ask you about today's modern politics. How does it echo perhaps the conflict between the anti-federalists and the federalists? And a lot of similarities exist.
Oh, yes. As a historian, I would say history does not repeat itself, because the context, the circumstances are always different. But certainly what we see is another manifestation of states' rights against federal government rights. And again, as I said, Hamilton, of course, saw that. He said, this will never be resolved. And so far, he's darn it, he's been right.
Well, you also you do talk about the Article 2. Why doesn't the Article 2 play the central role in your account of the Bill of Rights? And why are you certain that perhaps that your interpretation might be correct in terms of what the 18th century congressman meant about the article? I'd like to really get your thoughts on that second.
I think I'm correct, because I read every word they said in the debates.
Right.
Every time I would give a book talk on this book, of course, the first question from some guy would be, doesn't the Second Amendment guarantee my right? No, the Second Amendment does not. Modern interpretations of the Second Amendment do. You are absolutely right. In the 20th century, it was ruled by the courts that you have a right to carry a gun around with you. The original Bill of Rights does not guarantee that. And if I tell them, if you will read every word in the debate, you can read it just like I did online, and then we can talk about it. And of course, the answer I get with my favorite version was, I don't have to read what Madison said to know what Madison said. You can't argue with that. You can't argue with it. But I read every word they said, and I know the context in which that amendment was proposed. It was an anti-federalist, or I should say a states' rights proposal.
Right. The
declared concern, whether they really feared it or not, was that the federal government would raise an army and attack a state if the state did something the federal government didn't like. In other words, the tyranny of the federal government was the threat. And what could protect you from the tyranny of the federal government? Your state militia. You needed never to disband or give up the right to have a state army, because that was your protection against invasion by a tyrannical federal government. It was also, by the way, very practically if Indians were attacking you on the border, I
Right.
wonder why they might do that, because you were trying to grab their land. I have no sympathy with the states that made that demand. You could mobilize your state army quickly before the federal government could put together an army to attack, put down the Indian attack. So there was a practical consideration, and there was also the consideration that this was your state's protection against a tyrannical federal government. That was what they were concerned about. And they say so in the debate. They also say so many cockamamie things in the debate. People can't believe me when I say I often was in stitches laughing at some of the debate. There was some congressmen who had minimal IQs, really, then as today. And so let me just describe one of the debates. The question was, if you passed the Second Amendment that said that the states had a right to maintain their militias, that's what they meant. Could individuals appeal to say that they were against being armed, that they were pacifists, and refuse to participate in the militia? In other words, they were talking about religious groups like the Amish or the Quakers, who could say, I don't want to be mustered in the militia. Could they do this? If they did this, could you fine them? Could you fine them for not mustering in the militia and use the money to hire someone in their place? Roger Sherman gets up, he says, I think if somebody is morally opposed to arming themselves, they would also frown upon being asked to pay for somebody else to carry a gun. You know what? Okay, the second issue around this was, it's very dangerous to allow religious exceptions. One guy from New York stands up and he says, it would be a terrible thing, because as we know now, remember, this is 1789. We know that Americans aren't religious anymore. We know they're not going to church like they used to. And if the country is invaded from outside, people will all say they're Mennonites. And so they won't fight to protect the country. I mean, and I'm reading this and I'm going, why they picked Mennonites, I don't know. They could have picked the Amish or the Quakers, but Mennonites, everybody will say that, every man will say he's a Mennonite, and we won't have an army to protect the borders. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, this is a realistic fear.
Yeah.
So the biggest issue about Article 2 was not whether an individual can carry a gun. That was never, ever raised. The biggest issue was, could you claim a religious exemption? And that was what they were concerned about. Let me add that most individuals probably didn't own their own gun. That's why the states had armories. And when you mustered the militia, you handed out weapons to them.
Right.
I'm not saying nobody owned a gun. I'm not going to get involved in the debate over how do you count how many people own. But before the existence of a repeating rifle that had interchangeable parts, every gun was made individually. And if your gun broke, it's like owning a Jaguar if you live in a tiny rural area of Alabama, where I grew up in Alabama, so I'll use that state. And your Jaguar breaks. your local garage is not going to have Jaguar parts available.
Right.
And so if you owned a rifle and it broke, you would have to send the rifle somewhere to be fixed, and it would cost money, and it would take a long time. And so the state itself, in most cases, were the ones who kept arms, and they would pass them out, and then they would take them back. Because once the militia mustered, then they had nothing to do. Everybody, it was a big celebratory day because people gathered and they all got drunk afterwards. You know, it was a wonderful coming together. And so the right to individually own a gun, they didn't say an individual couldn't. They just didn't raise the issue at all.
Mm-hmm.
Just like in the Constitutional Convention, they didn't say women can't vote. They didn't say women could vote, because culturally it was understood that women can't vote. That's it. We don't have to mention it. And the same is true about this. They didn't say you can't own a gun, because that was beside the point on the articles, Article 2, which was originally Article 4, right? I have made this argument till I have been blue in the face, and it really seems to me this is such an emotional issue that making a historical argument, you know, I could threaten them with a gun, but otherwise I'm not going to be able to. Yeah. And I concede immediately that as of the 20th century, yes, that is what the Second Amendment says. Mm-hmm. But no, that is not what the men in the federal Congress intended.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing that some of the early conflicts between the states' writers and the national interpreters, such as the Whiskey Rebellion, probably lent credibility to the states' rights argument concerning the right to bear arms, and as a mistrust of the federal government, because they'll swoop in and take your control.
It's a perfect example, except, of course, I wrote a book about this too, in The Sovereign People, the first 10 years of the American federal government. Washington was very careful not to swoop in. Hamilton wanted them to swoop in. The Whiskey Rebels, the law was passed by Congress. They have to pay the tax. You have to send, what he would have sent in was militias from other states.
Right.
And hopefully the Pennsylvania militia to put the rebellion down. And by the way, the people engaged in the rebellion had done acts of violence, serious acts of violence. Mm-hmm. So Washington said, no, then everybody will say the federal government is tyrannical. So first he had it go to the courts. Then he sent in the commission. Then he passed a proclamation asking them to lay down their arms. Then he sent a commission. And only after he had done all of those things did he send a militia army in. And you know what happened? As soon as the militia army got close to the Whiskey Rebels all put their guns down. Not a shot was fired. Right. And what did Washington do? He granted amnesty to all of them.
Right.
So it was a marvelous example of how the federal government was not going to be tyrannical.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think you're right on target. Well, what's the difference between your approach to the Bill of Rights and perhaps the approach taken by certain lawyers and legal historians?
Most historians agree with me. I am not alone. And every time someone puts forward a case, every time a case is brought to limit the Second Amendment, we signed America's briefs, amicus briefs, supporting the original interpretation. So there are many historians who agree with me, But what is interesting is lawyers who are making the argument against the Second Amendment. I've been to conferences with them. Their idea of citing the history of the Second Amendment, it is not the same as a historian's idea.
Mm-hmm.
They're not interested, or they don't seem to be very interested in the context in which Madison proposed and what it meant at the time. Their idea of a history of the Bill of Rights is a history of legal cases that set precedents. And so they go back and they cite legal cases that set precedents that all come, by the way, after the Civil War. And anytime you say, wait a minute, that's not what Madison meant, I don't think they understand what you're talking about. They just think the history of the Second Amendment is the history of the judicial decisions in cases that set precedents. So we're not talking about the same thing. They're right. They're brilliant guys and women. They're right about those cases and the importance of those cases, but that doesn't have anything to do with what Madison intended. We historians, don't think the same way
Right.
lawyers think.
Interesting. Well, who did you like writing most about in your book?
Oh, well, I did like writing about James Madison. I liked discovering the complexity of his mind. I really did. I had never particularly liked him because, he really is a hypochondriac, and he really is filled. Almost every letter I ever read of James Madison's begins with, "I've come down with this mysterious disease. It may kill me." And of course, he leads a long life. He wasn't my favorite kind of guy, but I came to really appreciate him when I realized how he was able to maintain both an ideal understanding of the value of the Bill of Rights and a practical understanding of it. I also loved writing about Elbridge Gerry, who was such an obnoxious person. You really sometimes like to write about. It's not that he was a villain. He was just such an aggravation and such an unpleasant guy. No one liked him. No, he was the most unpopular person, and I could cite for you, and I do cite it in my book.
Right.
Endless numbers of comments between other members of the Congress who say, in essence, if only Elbridge Gerry would shut up. They really don't. And you'll forgive me, but I rarely make references to 21st century people, but he was the Ted Cruz of the 18th century.
Okay.
People just disliked him so much.
Right.
And so that made him fun to write about.
Yeah.
And he was smart as a whip. And his arguments, which were always anti-federalist arguments, and they were always interfering arguments. And he made the same one over and over and over and over again, even though everybody said, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to do that. The argument he made was always, at first it sounded absolutely reasonable. And then you parsed it and you realized that it wasn't reasonable at all. And so he was a lot of fun. He remained a lot of fun for me in the next book, in the book about the first federal Congress, because watching him when he was one of the ambassadors to France that led to the XYZ affair, he was a train wreck in causing the failure of Americans to form a treaty with France. And there he was, popping up again, doing the same thing he had done in the first federal Congress. So you need I won't call him a villain, but you need characters. You know, you need
Right.
to write about to sort of spice up your experience, because really reading the first federal Congress record is not always the most exciting thing you can do with your day. So he
Right.
was a great interruption to, as soon as he began to speak, I thought, oh, here it comes. So between Madison and Elbridge Gerry, they provided really the pleasure of writing this book.
Uh-huh. Well, Carol, you've written so many insightful books, particularly educating people about women in the American Revolution, focusing also on the Constitution and trials and tribulations over which our founding framers, if you will, brought us our nation. But why did you think it was important to specifically hone in on the Bill of Rights and write that book? And as a follow-up, what do you think is the most important takeaway from your book for readers?
Well, I wrote about it because I had a feeling that though it had been reified, that is, though it had become next to, along with the Declaration of Independence, even more than the Constitution, people speak about the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights as what America stands for. That when you ask students or people in grocery stores, you know, they really didn't know anything about the Bill of Rights. And so I thought, I want to write a book about it in its 18th century context, right? The thing that I want people to remember is how the Bill of Rights was available to become the credo of American society.
Mm-hmm.
Because people always, I think, assume it was written and then it became, it's just like the Constitution. Well, the Constitution was written and then everybody loved it and we lived happily ever after. Everybody didn't love it. You know, the first 10 years it was in existence, there were lots and lots of people. And then in the Civil War, there were lots and lots of people who, again, didn't love it. So I wanted people to see how it was written that made it available to become our credo. I'm not sure that, I haven't done a poll to find out what people do remember, but I fear that one of the things they remember is that I was wrong about the Second Amendment. So, you know, all you can do is try.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Carol Berkin, thank you for all the work you're doing to help educate Americans about our American Revolution and particularly our system of government. And for certainly joining me today on the Real American Revolution.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. And I hope I didn't say anything that shocked or angered your listeners.
I think we're fine there. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for viewing or listening to this edition of the Real American Revolution. My name is Randy Flood. Join us again next time for another exciting interview with an author or historian to talk about the real American Revolution. On behalf of myself, Carol Berkin, so long for now.